Thankful again for the opportunity and appreciate such a wonderful crowd here this morning. We began studying from Hebrews chapter 12 this morning. I want to turn back there, if you would, as we continue our study that we began in the 9:30 hour. Realize that we've dealt with some very tender topics, some very personal things, but hopefully these are things that you've been willing to make application of and to consider between you and God. This is certainly not about me. It's not about me and you. It's about our relationship with God, whether or not we truly want to go to heaven more than anything else. We started out this morning by looking at Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, where the inspired writer said, Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. We asked the question this morning, what do you want more than anything else? And expecting that most Christians should answer, I want to go to heaven more than anything else. It was a challenge this morning to see if we really want that more than anything else. Because if we do, we're going to be willing to lay aside every weight. We're going to be willing to reduce the encumbrances and the hindrances in our race, metaphorically, toward heaven. We've got to understand that if that is our desire to finish, we will lay aside anything that is hindering us or keeping us from getting there. We talked about the fact that there are times in our lives as Christians when it may seem like it is so difficult to be a Christian. When there seems to be so much that is asked of us or required of us, and why does it seem so difficult at times? Those are usually the times that we need to look around and see, are we holding on to some things that are not necessarily sinful, but that are not helpful? Things that are of a temporal nature, that have no bearing whatsoever on heaven. We don't need them in order to get to heaven, but we want them. Those are the kinds of things that hinder us, just like a runner might carry things that are not against the rules, but would hinder him from finishing the race. The key is our desire. Where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. The first one of these weights that we looked at this morning is the desire for worldly success, and the fact that there are many that are craving to have that estimation of success in the world's eyes. They want their peers, the people around them, maybe the people they grew up with, or their family, to say, you've made it, you've arrived, you've succeeded. And they want that sometimes more than they want God's approval. We need to study to show ourselves approved unto God, a workman that does not need to be ashamed. It is God's approval that we need to be seeking. We teach our kids that. That's how they're going to overcome peer pressure, is to seek God's approval and at all times. And as adults, we've got to do the same thing. And this doesn't end when we reach a certain age. There's always that desire to be approved of by the world. But we've got to realize that we may have to lay aside this weight, or we may have to be willing to give up success in the world's estimation in order to remain faithful to God. There's nothing wrong with being successful in temporal things if it's done honestly. But sometimes we have to be willing to forfeit that, as Daniel had to be willing to, Moses, Esther, the Apostle Paul. We also talked about the fact that women are being pressured today to follow after the world's standards of success and to pursue secular things because that we are trying, the world's trying to convince us that a woman cannot be fulfilled unless she does this. And we recognize that that's a lie. A woman is fulfilled when she fulfills God's purpose. We are all fulfilled. Men, women, and young people are fulfilled when we fulfill God's purpose. He made us a certain way, and the only way we are truly gratified in our soul is to fulfill that for which we were made for. We recognize that the woman's primary goal is to be a keeper at home, the domestic affairs. There are certainly times in life when there are not that many domestic duties and responsibilities. And she may have enough time to do a lot of things outside the home and keep that proper balance and that proper priority. There are other times when she may not be able to. We need to have the maturity to be able to see that and the humility to accept it when we don't see it but others do. In the multitude of counselors, there's safety. We have to have the maturity and the humility to realize that older Christians see dangers in our lives and in our families that we may not always see. We have to have the ability to be able to understand that. And so, in our families, as husbands, We need to see when our lives are frazzled and torn apart at the seams, and to understand that we need to help out in some of those things and to be able to help her with her duties. And one point I didn't make in the first hour this morning, but husbands, we need to understand that while success in the world's estimation is not wrong for a man or for a woman, there are going to be many opportunities that as men, as husbands, that we may be able to have both. We may be acclaimed and lauded by the world for being successful and still be righteous and godly and successful as God's servant. And we may hear that from both sides, from God and even from people of the world. But in most counts, our wives, if they are putting first their role and their duty as a homemaker, they will rarely hear from the world that they're successful. And if they're ever going to receive that well-deserved praise, it's going to be from their husbands and their children. And men, our children learn to praise their mother from their dad. They learn to praise their mother from their dad. If our wives are not hearing us genuinely from the heart, praising them and genuinely showing them the value we have for the sacrifice of worldly acclaim that they make to please God, our children aren't going to learn it. Our wives are going to feel unworthy, unloved, not valuable, and that's going to take a spiritual toll on them as well. I can't say enough about how important this is. And again, I'm not saying it's wrong for a woman to work outside the home. My wife has. She expects that she will. But there have been certain times in our lives where she's not been able to do that. She's had her hands full with domestic affairs. And we need to understand that there are going to be times in life like that. We cannot put these things before God. So let's go on to our next point. The next thing that I identified in my life that was a weight that was hindering me was this desire for worldly or the idea of temporal friends, or friends of the world is what I'm really trying to get at. Really, we might be able to identify this as popularity. That is, I want to be liked by everybody. Now, who doesn't? I guess there are a few people out there that seem like they don't want anyone to like them and to behave that way. But I think that most of us want to be approved of. We want to be liked. But the fact is, we will not be able to be liked by everyone. Now, there is nothing wrong with having friends that are not Christians. As a matter of fact, these are some of our greatest opportunities for evangelism. And we need to make friends of our neighbors. We need to be friendly. We need to be kind. We need to be the kind of person that a person wants to be friends with. And we'll have opportunities to study with them. But again, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If we treasure being friends with the world more than being friends with God, that's when the conflict is going to come up. As a matter of fact, this insatiable desire for people of the world to approve of us and befriend us seems to be what James is dealing with in James chapter 4 and verse 4. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Now that doesn't mean that if I have a friend that is not a Christian, that I'm in enmity with God. What he's describing here is that situation where my treasure is being liked by the world, having the world befriend me. When that's my treasure, I'm friends with the world and I'm at enmity with God. I'm at enmity with God's purpose. I'm at enmity with the cause of Christ. Because being a friend of the world, that is treasuring the friendship of the world, and being a friend of God, as Abraham was said to be, they cannot run on parallel lines. Again, I may have friends of the world, and I should have friends of the world if I'm a godly person. But I cannot put that above all other things. You know, this seeking the approval of people of the world is the very thing that we have to deal with our kids that we call peer pressure. And as I said earlier, this is not something that ends when we graduate from high school. I remember an older brother in Christ. He was well into his 90s. I think it was his 94th birthday. He was a member of the church in Amarillo, Texas. When I was preaching out in the Panhandle of Texas, I remember being told that on his birthday, someone asked him, Brother Pounds, what's the best thing about being 94? He said, no peer pressure. I guess there is a time in life, if we live long enough, where we won't have a lot of peer pressure because we don't have a lot of peers living. But most of our life, we're going to have those around us that we consider our peers, and because we want their approval. It might be our kids' friends' parents at school. It may be our kids' friends' parents on the ball team. Or it might be our friends at school or at work or wherever it might be. When we begin to pursue after that, we're putting ourselves in a place where that tug of war is going to make us absolutely miserable, and being a Christian is going to be difficult. Let me mention one area where this is especially difficult. Young people, I want you to pay particular attention to this. I am often asked about whether or not it is a sin to date or to marry a non-Christian. People say, well, I just don't understand how I can be right. Is it a sin to marry a non-Christian? And if it's a sin to marry a non-Christian, is it a sin to date a non-Christian? Well, we don't have time to explore that topic. I will just say this. In 1 Corinthians 7, we have an account where there were Christians married to non-Christians, and if it was a sin, in order to repent, they'd have to get out of that relationship, and they weren't commanded to do that. They were commanded to remain in that relationship. I cannot say that it's a sin for a Christian to be married to a non-Christian. However, it puts a tremendous strain on that Christian's faith. And it puts a person in a situation where they are going to have this tug of war. I would ask about the spiritual maturity of any Christian that would put themselves in a lifelong relationship where that is likely. But what about dating a non-Christian? Well, here's what I want us to consider. When we talk about dating a non-Christian, we need to understand some principles that are found there. In 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33, the Bible tells us, do not be deceived, evil company corrupts good habits. Now the context of 1 Corinthians 15 is in regard to false teachers, specifically those who are teaching error concerning the resurrection. I realize that. But here's what the inspired writer does. He takes a general principle of truth and applies it to that specific situation. So I want you to realize that this is a general principle of truth. Do not be deceived. That means that this is a very deceptive situation. Evil company corrupts good habits. How is that deceptive? Because we all, when we find that person that we especially want to be friends with, we're going to try to rationalize it and say, well, this is different. I know what you're saying, Lord, but this one's different. And God says, don't be deceived. We all want to think, well, I'm going to be a good influence on this person. That's why I'm befriending them. That's why I'm dating them. That's why I'm marrying them. I want to be a good influence on them. Well, let me tell you, the truth is that in relationships, it's most often like what we learned in science in elementary school, thermal equilibrium. When you pour cold and hot water together, what do you get? You get warm, lukewarm water. The cold makes the hot cooler, and the hot makes the cold warmer. Yes, I realize that you may have an influence on that person, but you know what else? They're going to have an influence on you. That's the reality, and that's where we need to be honest with ourselves. We're putting our own spiritual well-being at danger in doing this. And we've got to be careful about these types of friendships. How much influence are they having on us? When I have friends in the world, people that I have to work with, or my neighbors, and I have association, I have interaction with them, I try to make sure that that interaction involves spiritual values and that they know where I stand on things. That puts up some barriers. It puts up a hedge where they're not going to be able to influence me in an undue way. And I'm not going to choose them over Christians for entertainment. People say, well, Jesus spent time with sinners and he was criticized for that. What was he doing? Was he bowling with them? Was he going out on vacations with them? He was teaching them the truth. That's the time he was spending with these people. We need to be honest with ourselves about what we're doing. So when this idea of dating a non-Christian, we need to understand the dangers in relationships. Proverbs 12 and verse 26, young people, he says, the righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. The reality is the person that you are dating is going to have an influence and an impact on you. Let me tell you why. Because in most cases, you started dating because there was an attraction to that person. Now, it may have been an intellectual and emotional attraction to this person because of their values, their spirituality. We hope that that's the case. But I know that in most cases, as God has made us, there's also a physical attraction. And that emotional attraction goes hand in hand with that physical attraction. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we lose sight of what our objective is. And the longer that we date that person, the stronger those ties become, or those attractions become. And we become blinded, or at least our differences spiritually, and the detrimental effect they're having on us becomes blurred in our eyes. We don't see it as clearly because of that emotional attraction, that physical attraction, and that draw that is there. And then as we begin to fall in love, as is commonly put, we become emotionally bound to that person. We care what they think. I want to tell you, as you fall in love with a person, there is no one else in this world that is going to have a greater impact or influence on you than the person that you've fallen in love with. And then you say, well, but it's okay, Brett, because I'm just dating them, I'm not married to them. Well, without sounding trite, the saying is true. You marry who you date. And as you date someone, and the more you date them, the more you're attracted to them, and I know sometimes it doesn't work that way. The more you date them, the more that you're turned off. Realize that that can happen, but many times there's a person who's not a Christian, who does not have spiritual values, but they are physically attractive. They have a lot of things regarding their personality that's attractive. They're very charming, and they're wooing and winning our heart. And we begin to fall in love or be emotionally bonded to that person. And the further we go down that road, the closer we're getting to marriage. You know, a poll was taken one time, or it was a non-scientific poll. It was a gospel preacher that just polled those that he knew who were Christians that married other Christians, and those that he knew who were Christians that married non-Christians. And he just went back and he charted the outcome of their relationships. And as he looked at those Christians who married other Christians, he came up with 112 couples that he knew. 8 of them fell away, 7%. Of those Christians who married other Christians, there were 8 Christians who lost their faith and fell away. 93% of them remained faithful. 4% of them ended up divorced. But of those Christians that married non-Christians, he knew of 149 Christians who had married non-Christians. I think it's a little bit troubling that the number difference there. Far more Christians marry non-Christians than Christians marry Christians. Again, this has very much to do with spiritual maturity and seeing the dangers to ourselves and to our children. But out of that 149, 106 fell away. 106 fell away. Young people, are you looking at this? When you're thinking about dating someone who is not a Christian, and you know that dating, spending that time together, talking about things that are very personal, it engenders and it develops that bond, that emotional bond, that physical attraction, you're in closer proximity, and the more that that's built up, the closer you're getting to being married to that person. I want you to look at the odds. I want you to look at the odds. I remember I was preaching this sermon, talking about this in a gospel meeting one time, and after the sermon, the preacher's wife came up to me and said, "Brad, you want to know what happens when a Christian marries a non-Christian?" And I said, "Well, I think I know." And she said, right there, she pointed to her husband. He was the gospel preacher in that congregation. And I thought, you've got to be kidding me. I'm not saying that there weren't any couples that they both remained faithful. I'm not saying that. But you're telling me that in most cases, that's what happens? No, it's not. Can you imagine if I was a financial advisor and I was trying to get you, I tell you, I'm a gospel preacher, but I also do financial counseling, and I'd like you to invest with some mutual funds that I'm handling right now. You say, well, what's the success rate? Or what's the failure rate? Well, about 71% of people that invest in my mutual funds lose everything they got. They lose their retirement, their pension, they lose it all. They lose their house. I mean everything. The reality is, when a person falls away from the Lord, as a result, in part, of the person that they married, they lost everything. And far more than anyone who loses their retirement or their pension. This is the outcome. And I realize, as I said, this was not a scientific poll that polled a number from different segments and demographics. I realize that. But I want to tell you, most of us that have been Christians long enough can look at these numbers and say, that's pretty close to what I've seen. Now, as we look at that, 71% failure, 29% of them remained faithful. 30% of them ended up divorced. There was another thing that he considered that is always the crux of the matter. Because when a Christian marries a non-Christian, what is the rationalization? What is the justification every time? I'm going to convert them. How often did that happen? 18%. Again, what if I wanted you to invest with me and I had an 18% success rate with your money? You would laugh me off. There's not a soul here that would do it. And yet, why are so many young Christians entering into a relationship that has that kind of success rate and parents supporting it? We've got to understand the dangers. Now, let me say this. I remember talking to an older preacher about this my first couple of years of my preaching, and I was wondering, how do I advise people? And certainly, I know there are dangers out there, but how do I explain this? I mean, both of my brothers met and fell in love with girls that weren't Christians. They studied with them. They taught them the truth. When they got married, they were both Christians. My sister, she dated a young man who she studied with, and he learned the truth and obeyed the gospel, and he's a deacon in the church now. So how do I explain this? And I remember this older preacher saying, Brett, I'd rather my daughter marry a Cornelius than a Diotrephes. Now, if you understand the meaning of that, Cornelius, not being a Christian, was a man who had all the qualities to become one. He showed he was interested in God and spiritual things, and he was a sterling man and became a great Christian. Diotrephes was a Christian, and he was a horrible person. And so when we talk about marrying a Christian, that doesn't mean, young people, that all you've got to do is check a box. If this person goes to the Church of Christ, I can marry them. That has landed a lot of people in terrible problems. So it's not just about, has this person been immersed in water? It's about, does this person have a devotion to the Lord and to spiritual things? But even when we're talking about my sister-in-laws or my brother-in-law or dating these people who are not Christians, I will still say that both of my brothers and my sister put themselves in a realm of danger because they were already invested and in love before that person obeyed the gospel. The same thing to do is when you meet that person that you're interested in, you're attracted to them, you see qualities, and you would like to date that person, the very first place you start is to talk to them about spiritual things. See if that interest is there. See if they are a Cornelius. See if they'd be interested in studying the Bible with you and going to church or coming to a gospel meeting. That's usually going to be a tremendous telltale sign. And parents, that needs to be one of the requirements that we have with our kids. That they can, if they want to be around you, they can be around you at church. You can ride to church with them and ride home with them. These are the opportunities that you have. We need to be wise with our children's souls and what's at stake here. So when we're talking about this insatiable desire to be approved of by people of the world, young people, there is no one that is going to have a greater peer pressure on you than the person that you're in love with. And I want you to realize that I've been in that trap. I dated a girl for a number of years when I was living down the Dallas-Fort Worth area that was not a Christian. And a great deal of that tug of war that I was talking about, wondering why it was so hard to be a Christian, was because of the fact that I cared deeply for someone who was not a Christian, who did not share my values. Don't let yourself fall into that trap. It almost cost my soul. You look at Joshua 23 and verses 11 through 13, and Joshua warns the people about marrying those that were from other nations around them and how they would become a snare to the people. And that's exactly what happens in so many relationships. I've known of godly people, both men and women, who married non-Christians and have had to live the rest of their life in a relationship with someone who cared nothing about the Lord. And I've seen the toll it's taken on them, the sorrow, and the fact that when Christians get together, they can never be there as a couple. And the challenge they have with their children. And I have seen rare exceptions where a mother has taught and succeeded with all three of her kids. But by far the rule has been that it's been the minority of the children who's been rescued out of that situation. By far, in my experience, the majority of the children have gone the way of the world when one of their parents has not been a Christian. Why would you risk? It's one thing to risk your own relationship and your own happiness, but to risk the eternal souls of your kids, you need to be thinking further than just today. When we think about this desire to be befriended by the world, really what this boils down to is, we're wanting people to approve of us, and so, lo and behold, they begin to influence the way that we talk, the way that we dress, our entertainment, and other things like that. And why? Well, because we bought into the lie that in order to reach the world, I've got to become like the world. I've heard Christians tell me that. Well, Brett, you can't just be so Christ-like in your behavior that the world is going to be turned off by you. We've got to be in touch with the world if we're going to reach them. That's not what I read in the Bible. What I read in 2 Corinthians in chapter 6 and in verse 17 is that we need to come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I'll receive you. I'll tell you, the problem in the Lord's church today is there's too many Christians that are too in touch with the world, in the way they dress, in their secular interest, and other things like that. You look on social media, and you can see how in touch with the world a lot of Christians are, and tell me now, are they the people that are bringing people to Christ? Are they the people that are arranging the Bible studies and getting baptisms? I want to tell you they're not. And I'll tell you why they're not. Because we don't reach the world by being like the world. We're going to reach the world by being separate from the world. In 1 Peter 3 and verse 15, Peter writes, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." Did you notice that? People are going to ask us a reason for our faith, for our hope. Why? Because we're different. If we act like and seem like the world, why is the world going to come to us for a solution? If it looks like we're doing the same thing they're doing, you know what the world thinks? They think we're lucky. They think that our ship just came in. We're just luckier than them, and they're unlucky, and so they're hoping to get lucky. And so maybe they need to play the lottery more. Maybe they need to buy more scratch-offs, and then they'll have a happier life. The reason people are going to ask us, and here's the evangelistic opportunity, for a reason, for the hope that lies within us, is because they see that we're different. They see that we have different values. They see that we conduct our lives with our children differently. They see that we have different choices in our life. They see that our lives are pure, the way we dress, our entertainment, that our kids won't go to those movies with their kids, that our kids will not play in those sporting events and forsake the Lord. And there's a time when they think, oh, we're crazy. But when they're down and out, or when they see us going through tribulation, and that we have joy in the midst of that tribulation, when our marriage is strong and the bond is good, when our children are respectful and godly, and when they're going through their bad times, then they look at us and they ask a reason for the hope that lies within us. That's what we need to be seeking, more than just the friendship of the world. You know, the church needs to be changing the world, not the world changing the church. We are God's own peculiar people, Titus 2:11 through 14. But I want you to notice another thing that is a tremendous weight to Christians today, and that is a desire for pleasure or fun. This desire for recreation. And I want you to understand, obviously, there's nothing wrong with being successful in the eyes of the world, nothing wrong with having friends that are not Christians. There's nothing wrong with recreation. God made us in such a way that we need recreation. Think of the word, recreate, recreate. We need to understand that there is a time and a place in our life where we need rest, we need relaxation, we need to restore and recreate ourselves. All work and no play not only makes us a dull boy, but it has an effect on our spirit. God wants us to recreate, but there's a healthy way to do that, and there is a place for it. You know, recreation is kind of like dessert. I gave in, had a little dessert last night. Actually, I had a lot. And I regretted it. And you know, so when we get that out of balance, you know, there's nutritious food, and then there's that food that's sweet to the taste. And there's nothing wrong in moderation with that, in the right way. But my kids, every one of them, have gone through stages in life where they want dessert first. And if they could have their way, they would have a dinner, a meal of dessert, and then a little bit of the nutritious food. Well, we know that that's not good for them. And likewise, what happens to us if we're not careful is we get caught up in recreation to where our goal is, I want to spend as much time in recreation as I can. If I'm really happy and successful, I'm going to find a way where I'm going to get to just go water skiing or hunting or whatever my passion is and do that all the time. Let me tell you, that's not the way God made us. And we're not going to find gratification when that's all that we do. I know for a little while that's going to be fun. A little while. You know, pleasure's deceitful. The fact is, it brings many under bondage. 2 Timothy 3 and verses 1 through 5, Paul wrote to Timothy and said, "Know this, that in the last days," which we're living in today, "perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy." That's a pretty bad list, isn't it? But notice, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Is it wrong to have pleasure in life? Certainly not. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We can't serve two masters. This is what happens. And he's telling us that we can become lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. And verse 5 he says, these people have a form of godliness. They're at church a lot. And they fill in the right answers and the blanks. They have a form of godliness but deny its power. Their lives are not transformed. They're not spiritual. They're temporal minded. And from such people, turn away. Remember W.R. Jones saying one time in the gospel meeting that I heard, he said, you know, recreation is kind of like an electric wire. We get a hold of it and then it gets a hold of us. And that is the way that it works, isn't it? We go out and we buy that camper or we get that boat or whatever it might be that we really enjoy doing. And that's great. I've got a camper and I wish I had a boat. And we go out and we spend a reasonable amount of time and we spend time with our family and that's a wholesome and a good thing to do. But pretty soon you'll see Christians where, man, they invested a lot of money in this thing and you know, we're not getting much time, so we're going to stay the weekend there and we're going to worship somewhere else this week. And before long, you're only part-time members where they're members. And then they get to where, well, they're only going to part of the service because we need to get in as much time with this item as we possibly can. And look, it's not just with these types of items. There's a lot of ways that we can get caught up in pleasure. We can, you know, our generation, my dad grew up in the Depression era. And listening to what his life was like, sometimes I can't even wrap my mind around that what life was like in his generation. We have so much. But we've got a generation today that thinks somehow that we've got to give our kids everything we can possibly give them to make their life full. In a lot of ways, we're ruining them. Because we think that we've got to recreate them, they've got to play this and play that and do this and do that. When in reality, sometimes what our kids need to do is work with Dad and help Mom clean the house. And what's going to happen is, in the end, That's going to be their sweetest memories with their parents. Building fence like I did with my dad. I hated doing that. Digging post holes. But I'll tell you, as I think back on my life, the best lessons I learned from my dad and the sweetest time I spent with my dad is in doing some of those things. And he balanced it. We went fishing and quail hunting too. What we need to understand is that our kids don't need all the fun. And we've got a generation that's raising their kids to where, and my kids are in sports. I understand the challenge. But we've got to be in this game, we've got to travel to this tournament, we've got to be over here, and kids are coming into church on Wednesday night still in their uniforms, so worn out from practice or falling asleep, they can't even focus on their Bible lesson. Where's our priorities? Recreation has its place, but we're going to ruin our kids if they think that that's what the happy life is. And a lot of kids are being convinced of that. What our kids need to be doing is going to gospel meetings with their parents and singing hymns in the car on the way and going to visit the elderly and seeing what a widow needs and having the gratification that a young person gets when they serve somebody that's older than them, when they even know someone who's older than them, when they care about what's going on with someone who's older than them. We get caught in the trap where we think our kids just need to be around young people. And yes, it's good to have young Christians with other young Christians, but you know what else is good? To have young Christians with older Christians. And our kids are not going to choose that, they're going to be taught that. They're going to be trained that. But this addiction to pleasure, it reminds me of Samson. He was a great man of faith in many regards. He's mentioned in Hebrews 11. But you know what his feet of clay were? He was a self-indulgent man. When he told his parents to go and get a Philistine woman for him to marry. And when they questioned him about it, he said, "Get her for me, for she pleases me well." And that outlined his life, and that's what led him to his disastrous end. Self-indulgent. You know, that's the difference between Esau and Moses. Esau was a man, Hebrews 12 verse 16 says, was a profane man who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. It was all temporal, here and now. But Moses, on the other hand, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. You've got to teach our kids that when they're young, brethren. This desire for pleasure or fun is dangerous. And then finally, the desire for wealth. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy. It's not evil in and of itself. Abraham was wealthy. Job was wealthy. But again, the desire for wealth is a tremendous weight. That's what we see in the Bible, in Proverbs chapter 23 and in verse 4. You know, the Bible warns us there. In Proverbs 23, turn over to that passage with me. Proverbs chapter 23. I don't know if you were familiar with this passage before today, but I want you to notice there in verse 4, the King James Version says, "Labor not to be rich. Because of your own understanding, cease." What does that mean? Stop it. Stop what you're doing. Did you know the Bible says that? Labor not to be rich. And that word labor means to expend or exhaust yourself. There are a lot of Christians doing that. They are wearing themselves out, burning the candle at both ends, working ridiculous hours, and paralyzed as a member of a local church because they think they've got to get here financially and then they're going to give their life to God. And the Bible says, don't do that. You know why? Look at verse 5. "Will you set your eyes on that which is not? For riches certainly make themselves wings. They fly away like an eagle toward heaven." It's an elusive dream. You're not going to acquire it. The eye is not satisfied with silver. We've got to learn to be content with such things as we have and find our riches in God's approval. Let Him bless us with the resources that we need to give back to Him and to be a steward of His things. But don't pursue this wealth. Someone says, "Well, Abraham was wealthy." That's right. And Abraham never put it before the Lord. Job was wealthy, never put it before the Lord. Do you live a life of faith like those men? No problem with that. That's great. But when a person is missing the assemblies, they're not there for their family, they're not leading spiritually, and they're trying to compare themselves to Abraham and Job, that's a little offensive. We don't have a problem with Abrahams and Jobs in the church. It's with Esau's. It's with people that are putting these material things first in their life. You know, in Mark 4 and verse 19, Jesus said, "And the cares of this world, and the deceitfulness of riches, and the desire for other things entering in, choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful." That's what happens. That's the reality. Matthew 19 verse 24, "Again I say to you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to go to heaven." He's not saying it's impossible to be rich and go to heaven. It's hyperbole. He's using an exaggeration to make a point, but here's what he is saying. It creates difficulty. It creates difficulty. And we've got to be wise in our use of that. We've got to be mindful of these things. 1 Timothy 6 and verses 9 through 10, he talks about the man who desires to be rich. Not the rich man. The man who desires to be rich. And he says that that man pierces himself through with many sorrows and is drowning in misery. That's the person who's pursuing after this. We need to understand that wealth can become such a tremendous weight in our lives spiritually. Well, there's so much more to be said. But as we close this morning, I want you to remember our text in Hebrews 12 says, "Let us lay aside every weight and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." Do you really want to go to heaven? The Bible says if you do, you need to lay aside these things that are not inherently sinful, that are an encumbrance, that are a hindrance to you, in order to run. In order to run like the people that are mentioned just earlier in chapter 11, who gave their lives to be faithful to God, our examples, to run with endurance and to be prepared for persecution. I want to read one last passage as we close. Look in 2 Timothy chapter 2. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, this is one of those passages like Hebrews 12 and like we just read in Proverbs chapter 23, where he tells us the laborer not to be rich. But in 2 Timothy in chapter 2, he tells us here, beginning in verse 2, "The things that you've heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." Verse 3, "You therefore must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No one engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier." Brethren, I may have stepped on some toes. I hope I stepped on some hearts. I may have hurt some feelings. Things may be a little bit tender. I may have touched on some things, and I don't know you. It's not personal for me. I mean, it's personal for you. I want it to be personal for you. But I don't know you. But if there's some tender things that I've touched on, or if you've got your feelings hurt, what this is about is whether or not we're all going to be able to spend eternity in heaven. And if it hurts to hear some things for us to get there, then so be it. But the reality is, there are too many of us, myself included. This is a constant battle for me. When he tells us to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, that's a daily thing that I've got to wake up every morning. And I've got to willingly lay myself on the altar for God every day, just like you do. Whether I'm a preacher or not. And I get caught up in my hobbies and my entertainment. I get caught up in retirement and what I have and what I'm not going to have. This is a battle for me, but here's what I recognize. Is that the temporal things of this life are made in such a way that they entangle me. And eventually Jennifer and I reach a point and we look at each other and say, we need to simplify. We need to simplify. We need to lay aside some things. And it's liberating and refreshing spiritually to do that. I hope you will do that very thing. I hope you'll be willing to lay these things aside. You know, when we think, does God really want me to get rid of this job so that I can be here faithfully? Does God really want me to lay aside this friendship or this relationship? When you're tempted to ask a question like that, I want you to look at Jesus hanging on the cross. I want you to go to Matthew 27 and to read of him being spit on in the face, slapped in the face while blindfolded, scourged almost to death, and a crown of thorns put on his head so that you and I can go to heaven. And then to ask the question, does God really expect me to be here every Wednesday night, every Sunday morning? And you will hear how disgusting it sounds to even ask that question. We should be willing to lay aside anything And if we're not, we're lying to ourselves if we're telling ourselves that we're taking up our cross daily and following Him. Whatever you need to do to be right with God this morning, do it. If you need to obey the gospel, come believing in Him, repent of your sins, confess your faith in Him, and be baptized in water for the remission of sins. And if as a child of God, you're encumbered with so many weights, then lay those aside. If you need our prayers, we'll pray with you and for you. We will help you by being an accountability friend. But make yourself right with God before we leave. And I hope that this is going to answer any conflicts that you have this week with this gospel meeting. And I hope that this effort to save the lost in this community is going to be the first thing for you every day this week. I hope there's not even a question. Whatever your need is, would you please come and stand and sing invitation.